The letter arrived on a Tuesday, crumpled and stained, as if it had been clutched too tightly by trembling hands. "You know, son of mine," it read, the words slicing through Caleb's heart like a branding iron. At 19, he stood alone on the porch of his family's Wyoming ranch, the only home he'd ever known, now barred to him forever. Caleb's boots crunched against the gravel as he walked away, the weight of his backpack nothing compared to the ache in his chest. The sprawling plains of Laramie stretched before him, endless and indifferent, mirroring the rejection that had just shattered his world. He'd always known his father, a stern rancher with a Bible in one hand and a rifle in the other, would never accept him. But knowing and living it were two different beasts. He'd come out to his family the night before, his voice steady despite the fear clawing at his throat. His mother had wept silently, her eyes pleading for him to take it back, to say it was a mistake. His father, though, had erupted, his face red with rage, calling Caleb an abomination before throwing him out into the cold Wyoming night. The door had slammed shut, the lock clicking with finality, and Caleb had stood there, stunned, until the chill forced him to move. Now, with nowhere to go, Caleb hitched a ride into town, the truck's radio blaring country tunes that felt like mockery. Laramie wasn't kind to people like him. The whispers followed him everywhere, churchgoers clutching their crosses, old friends turning away in the diner. He'd heard of a shelter on the edge of town, a place for those with nowhere else to turn. It wasn't much, but it was a roof, and Caleb needed that more than pride right now. The shelter was a squat, gray building, its paint peeling like old skin. Inside, the air smelled of damp concrete and desperation. A tired-looking woman at the desk handed him a form, her eyes barely meeting his. "Cause for intake?" she asked, pen poised. Caleb swallowed hard. Kicked out. For being gay. Her pen paused, and for a moment, he thought he saw a flicker of sympathy. Then she nodded, scribbling something down, and handed him a key to a shared room. "Keep your head down," she muttered. "Not everyone here is friendly." The room was cramped, with 4 cots squeezed against the walls. Caleb's bunkmate was a lanky guy about his age, with tousled brown hair and eyes that seemed to carry their own storm. He introduced himself as Ethan, his voice soft but steady, like he'd learned to speak carefully. "What's your story?" Ethan asked, leaning back on his cot, arms crossed. Caleb hesitated, the words still raw. "My dad didn't take kindly to me being me." Ethan nodded, no judgment in his gaze. "Same. My folks sent me to one of those conversion camps. Ran away when they started talking about fixing me with electric shocks." Caleb's stomach twisted. He'd heard those places whispered about in church basements like ghost stories. "How'd you end up here?" "Got caught stealing food from a gas station," Ethan said with a wry smile. Figured a shelter was better than jail. They talked late into the night, their voices low to avoid waking the others. Ethan had a way of listening that made Caleb feel seen, not as a sinner or a problem, but as a person. For the first time since his world had collapsed, Caleb felt a spark of something. Hope, maybe, or just the relief of not being alone. Days at the shelter blurred into a routine of lukewarm meals and tense silences. The other residents were a mix of lost souls, addicts, runaways, and a few others like Caleb and Ethan, cast out for who they were. The staff did their best, but resources were thin and tempers flared easily. Caleb learned quickly to avoid certain corners of the common room, where guys with hard eyes muttered slurs under their breath. Ethan, though, was a light in the gloom. He had a sharp wit and a knack for finding humor in the smallest things, like the way the shelter's coffee tasted like burnt regret. One afternoon, as they sat on a bench outside, Ethan nudged Caleb's shoulder. "You ever think about what's next? Like where you'd go if you could?" Caleb stared at the horizon, the mountains jagged against the sky. "Back to the ranch, maybe. Not my dad's, but somewhere I could work the land, be free." Ethan's eyes softened. "Sounds nice. Me, I'd head to the coast. Somewhere nobody cares who you love." Their dreams felt like fragile things, easily crushed by the reality of their situation. But in that moment, sitting close enough to feel the warmth of Ethan's arm against his, Caleb let himself believe they could be real. That night, trouble came. A group of older guys, led by a burly man named Roy, cornered Caleb in the hallway. Roy's voice was a low growl, his words dripping with venom. "We don't need your kind here, cowboy." Caleb stood his ground, his fists clenched. "I'm not looking for trouble." Roy stepped closer, his breath sour. "You're trouble just by existing." Before Caleb could respond, Ethan appeared, his voice calm but firm. "Back off, Roy. He's not alone." Roy sneered but retreated, his cronies following. Ethan turned to Caleb, his expression fierce. "You okay?" Caleb nodded, his heart racing, not just from the confrontation, but from the way Ethan had stood up for him. Something shifted between them, a silent promise that they'd face whatever came next together. The shelter wasn't safe, not really, but as Caleb lay on his cot that night, listening to Ethan's steady breathing across the room, he felt a fire kindling inside him. He wasn't just a kid kicked out for being gay. He was a cowboy, born to fight for his place in the world. And with Ethan by his side, he was starting to believe he could win. The days grew colder, and the shelter's thin walls did little to keep out the Wyoming wind. Caleb and Ethan found solace in their shared defiance, carving out moments of connection amidst the chaos. But the tension with Roy and his crew simmered, a storm waiting to break. One morning, Caleb overheard Roy in the common room, his voice loud enough to carry. "They're diseased, those two. This place ain't a haven for sinners." The words stung, but Caleb had learned to keep his head down. Ethan, though, wasn't so restrained. He shot back. "Maybe you're the one who doesn't belong here, Roy." The room went quiet, all eyes on Ethan. Roy's face twisted, and for a moment, Caleb thought he'd lunge. But a staff member stepped in, barking at everyone to scatter. Ethan grabbed Caleb's arm, pulling him outside. "We need a plan," he said, his breath visible in the chilly air. "This place isn't safe for us." Caleb nodded, his mind racing. He'd been saving the little money he earned from odd jobs around town, cleaning stables, hauling hay. It wasn't much, but it was a start. "There's a ranch outside Laramie," he said. "Old man Jenkins hires hands, no questions asked. If we could get there, maybe we'd have a shot." Ethan's eyes lit up. "A ranch? You be in your element, cowboy." The idea took root, but getting out wasn't simple. The shelter had rules, curfews, check-ins, and Roy's crew watched them like hawks. Caleb and Ethan started planning in whispers, mapping out routes, and pooling their meager resources. They'd need bus fare, food, and a way to slip out unnoticed. Their bond deepened as they worked. Late at night, when the shelter was quiet, they'd sit on Ethan's cot, knees touching, sharing stories of better days. Ethan talked about his childhood in Colorado, riding bikes through suburban streets until his parents found out about his first crush, a boy from math class. Caleb shared memories of roping calves under the wide Wyoming sky, the only place he'd ever felt free. Their laughter was soft, cautious, but it filled the cracks in their hearts. One evening, as they sat outside watching the stars, Ethan reached for Caleb's hand. The touch was electric, grounding Caleb in a way he hadn't felt since leaving the ranch. "You ever think about what it'd be like to just be?" Ethan asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Caleb's throat tightened. "All the time, but not here. Not like this." Ethan leaned closer, their shoulders brushing. "Then let's make it happen. Together." The moment hung between them, fragile and perfect, until a shout from inside broke the spell. Roy and his crew were at it again, harassing another resident. Caleb's fist clenched, but Ethan squeezed his hand. "Not now," he murmured. "We pick our battles." The next day, Caleb found work at a feed store, hauling sacks of grain for a few bucks. The owner, a gruff man named Hank, took a liking to him. "You're a hard worker, kid," Hank said, tossing him an extra 10. "Heard you're at the shelter. Rough place." Caleb nodded, wary of saying too much. But Hank's eyes were kind, and when he offered Caleb a ride to the edge of town, Caleb accepted. On the drive, Hank mentioned Jenkins' ranch. "Good man, Jenkins. Always looking for hands. You got the look of someone who belongs on the land." The words stuck with Caleb, fueling his resolve. Back at the shelter, he told Ethan about the job lead. They spent the night refining their plan. Save enough for bus tickets, slip out during the night shift when security was lax, and head to Jenkins' ranch. It was a gamble, but it was theirs. But Roy wasn't done with them. One night, as Caleb and Ethan returned from a late shift at the feed store, Roy and two others blocked their path in the shelter's parking lot. "Going somewhere, queers." Roy spat, cracking his knuckles. Caleb stepped forward, his voice steady. "We're not your problem, Roy. Let us pass." Roy laughed, a cruel sound. "You don't belong here. Or anywhere." Ethan moved to Caleb's side, his stance defiant. "You don't get to decide that." The standoff was interrupted by headlights, a staff member's car pulling in. Roy backed off, but his glare promised trouble. Caleb and Ethan hurried inside, hearts pounding. "We need to move faster," Ethan said, his voice urgent. "He's not going to stop." Caleb agreed. They doubled their efforts, taking every job they could find. Caleb's hands grew calloused, his muscles aching, but each dollar brought them closer to freedom. Ethan took on extra shifts at a diner, charming customers for tips despite the exhaustion in his eyes. One night, as they counted their savings, $1.87, enough for 2 bus tickets, Caleb looked at Ethan and felt something shift. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was about building something, a life where they could be themselves. He reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Ethan's forehead. "We're going to make it," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ethan smiled, leaning into the touch. Yeah, Cowboy, we are. The plan was set. Tomorrow night, they'd leave. Caleb and Ethan had their tickets, their bags packed with essentials, and a map to Jenkins Ranch. But as the day dawned, the shelter felt like a pressure cooker, ready to explode. Roy's hostility had escalated. He'd taken to spreading rumors, turning more residents against them. At breakfast, Caleb felt eyes on him, heard whispers behind his back. Ethan, usually quick with a quip, was quiet, his jaw tight. We just need to get through today, he said, squeezing Caleb's hand under the table. The day dragged, each hour heavy with anticipation. Caleb worked a final shift at the feed store, his mind on the escape. Hank noticed his distraction. You okay, kid? He asked, stacking bags of oats. Caleb hesitated, then decided to trust him. I'm leaving tonight. Got a job lined up at Jenkins Ranch. Hank's eyes softened. Good for you. Jenkins is fair. You'll do all right. He slipped Caleb a folded 20. For the road. Caleb's throat tightened. Thanks, Hank. Back at the shelter, Ethan was waiting, his bag slung over his shoulder. Ready? He asked, his voice low. Caleb nodded, but his stomach churned. The night shift guard was lazy, often dozing off, but Roy's crew was unpredictable. They waited until midnight, the shelter quiet except for the hum of fluorescent lights. Slipping out was easier than expected. The guard was snoring at his desk, but as they reached the parking lot, headlights flared. Roy stepped out of a beat-up truck, his cronies behind him. Thought you could just leave? He sneered, blocking their path. Caleb's heart pounded, but he stood tall. We're done here, Roy. Let us go. Roy laughed, stepping closer. You don't get to walk away. Not after disgracing this place. Ethan moved forward, his voice sharp. You're the disgrace, picking on people who just want to live. Roy swung, his fist aimed at Ethan's face. Caleb reacted on instinct, shoving Ethan out of the way and taking the hit. Pain exploded across his jaw, but he stayed on his feet, years of ranch work hardening his resolve. You want to fight? Caleb growled. You got one. The scuffle was quick and brutal. Caleb tackled Roy, landing a solid punch before one of Roy's friends pulled him off. Ethan jumped in, his movements swift despite his slighter frame. They fought back to back, holding their own until a shout from the shelter's entrance stopped everyone cold. The night guard, now awake, held a flashlight like a weapon. Enough, he bellowed. Roy and his crew backed off, muttering curses, and the guard glared at Caleb and Ethan. Get out. Now. They didn't need to be told twice. Grabbing their bags, they ran, the cold air stinging their lungs. The bus station was a mile away, and they reached it just as the 1 a.m. bus to the outskirts of Laramie pulled in. They collapsed into their seats, bruised but unbroken, their hands finding each other in the dark. The ranch was a sprawling spread of land, its barns weathered but sturdy. Jenkins, a wiry man with a gray beard, met them at the gate. You the boys Hank called about? He asked, sizing them up. Caleb nodded, his jaw still throbbing. Yes, sir. We're hard workers. Jenkins grunted, pointing to a bunkhouse. Prove it. Work starts at dawn. The bunkhouse was basic but clean, a far cry from the shelter's gloom. That night, as they settled in, Ethan cleaned a cut on Caleb's cheek, his touch gentle. You didn't have to take that hit from me, he said softly. Caleb met his eyes, his heart full. Yeah, I did. Life on the ranch was grueling but honest. Caleb thrived, his hands steady as he roped cattle and mended fences. Ethan, less experienced, learned fast, his determination matching Caleb's. The other hands were a mixed bunch, some gruff, others kind, but Jenkins ran a tight ship, and no one bothered them. One evening, after a long day, they rode out to a quiet corner of the ranch. The sunset painted the sky in hues of orange and pink, and Caleb felt a peace he hadn't known in months. Ethan dismounted, tethering his horse, and turned to Caleb with a smile. This is it, isn't it? What you wanted? Caleb dismounted, standing close. Almost. He took Ethan's hand, their fingers lacing together. It's better with you. They stood there, the world vast and open around them, their connection a quiet rebellion against everything that had tried to break them. But even as they savored the moment, Caleb knew the world outside the ranch wouldn't be so kind. They'd fought to get here, but the bigger fight for acceptance, for a place to call home, was far from over. The ranch became their sanctuary, but the world beyond its borders loomed large. Caleb and Ethan settled into a rhythm, their days filled with hard work and their evenings with stolen moments, quiet conversations under the stars, hands brushing as they passed tools. Yet the weight of their pasts lingered, and Caleb couldn't shake the feeling that their peace was temporary. Jenkins noticed their dedication, giving them more responsibilities. Caleb took to training horses, his calm presence earning their trust. Ethan, with his quick mind, handled the ranch's books, catching errors that had slipped past others. The other hands warmed to them, some even sharing beers after work, but Caleb remained cautious, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. One afternoon, a letter arrived for Caleb, forwarded from the shelter. His mother's handwriting was unmistakable, delicate, and precise. He opened it with trembling hands, Ethan at his side. "I'm sorry," it read. "I pray for you every day, but your father won't bend. I hope you're safe. No return address. No promise of more." Caleb crumpled the paper, his eyes burning. Ethan pulled him close, his voice soft. "She still loves you. That's something." Caleb nodded, but the rejection stung anew. "It's not enough," he said, his voice breaking. "I wanted a family, not just a letter." Ethan held him tighter, and in that embrace, Caleb found the strength to keep going. They weren't just surviving anymore. They were building something, a life, a partnership, a future. But the world outside the ranch was less forgiving. Rumors about them spread in town. A local pastor, known for his fire and brimstone sermons, began preaching against sinners like Caleb and Ethan, his words reaching the ranch through gossip. Some hands grew distant, their laughter replaced by sidelong glances. Jenkins, to his credit, shut down any trouble, but Caleb felt the shift. "We're not safe here forever," he told Ethan one night, their voices low in the bunkhouse. Ethan agreed. "We need a long-term plan, somewhere we can be us, no hiding." They started researching, dreaming of places like San Francisco or Portland, where acceptance wasn't just a hope but a reality. The internet at the ranch was spotty, but Ethan found forums and stories of others who'd escaped small-town prejudice. The more they read, the more possible it seemed, a life where they could walk hand in hand without fear. But dreams required money, and theirs was still tight. They saved every penny, skipping meals in town to cut costs. Jenkins noticed, offering them extra work on weekends. "You boys are the best hands I've got," he said gruffly. "Don't let the town's nonsense get to you." Caleb was grateful, but the pastor's influence grew. One Sunday, a group of protesters appeared at the ranch's gate, holding signs with verses from Leviticus. Caleb's stomach churned as he recognized faces from his father's church. Ethan grabbed his arm, pulling him back. "Don't engage," he said. "They want a reaction." Jenkins handled it, threatening to call the sheriff, and the protesters left. But the incident shook Caleb. "They're not going to stop," he said, his voice tight. "Not until they drive us out." Ethan's eyes blazed. "Then we don't let them. We fight smarter, not harder." They doubled down on their plan, working overtime and researching legal protections. Ethan found a pro bono lawyer in Cheyenne who helped them understand their rights. "You're not alone," the lawyer said over a crackly phone line. "There are communities out there waiting for you." The words gave Caleb hope, but also a new fear. Leaving Wyoming meant leaving everything he'd known, the land, the sky, the life of a cowboy. Could he be himself without it? Ethan seemed to sense his doubt, pulling him aside one evening as they mended a fence. "You're not giving up who you are," he said, his voice firm. "You're just finding a place where all of you fits." Caleb looked into Ethan's eyes, seeing the same determination that had kept them going through the shelter's darkest days. He leaned in, their lips meeting in a kiss that felt like a vow. "Okay," he whispered. "Together." The next week, trouble struck. A fire broke out in one of the barns, small but suspicious. Jenkins suspected arson, pointing to tire tracks that didn't match any ranch vehicles. The pastor's followers were the likely culprits, though no proof tied them directly. The hands rallied to save the barn, Caleb and Ethan working side by side, their faces streaked with soot. As they collapsed, exhausted, Jenkins clapped them on the shoulders. "You boys saved my livestock. I owe you." Caleb shook his head. "Just doing our job, sir." But Jenkins' gratitude meant more than he knew. It was a reminder that they weren't just outcasts. They were capable, valued, strong. And as they stood together, watching the embers fade, Caleb felt a fire of his own burning brighter. They weren't just fighting to survive anymore. They were fighting for their place in the world. The fire marked a turning point. Caleb and Ethan knew they couldn't stay much longer, not with the town's hostility creeping closer. Jenkins offered them a permanent place, but the ranch, for all its safety, was still in Laramie's shadow. They needed more than a refuge. They needed a home. Their savings grew, bolstered by Jenkins' bonuses and their relentless work. By spring, they had enough for 2 one-way tickets to Portland, a city they'd chosen for its promise of acceptance. The night before they left, Jenkins threw a small send-off, just the hands who'd stood by them. "You boys are family," he said, raising a glass. "Don't forget us." Caleb's eyes stung as he clinked glasses with Ethan. "We won't, sir." The bus ride was long, the Wyoming plains giving way to mountains, then forests. Caleb watched the landscape change, his hand in Ethan's, their future uncertain, but theirs to shape. Portland was overwhelming at first, crowded, loud, so different from the open range. But it was also alive with possibility. They found a cheap apartment, cramped but theirs, and jobs at a community center that served queer youth. The center became their anchor. Caleb led workshops on resilience, drawing on his cowboy roots to teach kids how to stand tall. Ethan counseled runaways, his empathy a lifeline for those who'd lost everything. They built a community, not just for themselves, but for others who'd been kicked out, locked away, or told they didn't belong. One evening, as they walked through a park, hand in hand under fairy lights strung through the trees, Caleb stopped. "This is it," he said, his voice thick. "What we fought for." Ethan smiled, pulling him close. Not just fought for, claimed. They kissed, unafraid, the world around them indifferent in the best way. No glares, no whispers, just two people in love, free to be. Caleb thought of his father's letter, of Roy's fists, of the shelter's cold walls. Each had tried to break him, but he'd fought back, not with violence, but with courage, with love, with Ethan. Years later, Caleb and Ethan returned to Wyoming, not to Laramie, but to a small ranch they'd saved for. It was theirs, bought with years of hard work and a loan from Jenkins, who'd become a mentor. They ran it together, training horses and hosting queer youth from across the state, offering them a place to heal, to be. One sunset, as they stood on their porch, the sky ablaze, Caleb carved their initials into a fence post, a quiet echo of the image that had marked their story's start. Ethan leaned against him, his voice soft. "You ever think we get here?" Caleb shook his head, his arm around Ethan. "Not in a million years. But I'd fight it all again for this." Their ranch became a beacon, proof that love could endure, that a cowboy could be gay and still claim his power. They weren't just surviving. They were thriving, their lives a testament to the strength found in standing true to oneself. And as the stars emerged, Caleb knew they'd built more than a home. They'd built a legacy, one that would outlast the hate they'd overcome, a story written in courage and carved in love.